Hi, everyone. I'm Rashonda Cade. This is Reading with Rashonda. We are reading from Pauline Hopkins, Hagars' daughter. We are on chapter 32. But before we get started, it has literally been like a year since I made my last recording, and I don't really remember what's happening in the book. I have, a general idea. I remember what the book is about. So I'm going to be reacquainting myself with the book. Why has it been a literal year since I have done a reading? My life has been very full in many unexpected ways, and trying to get my bearings through all of that. And also, you'll notice that my background looks a little different. I'm actually in the same space, but I've reoriented it, and I have a lamp back there that's got little like sparkle lights twisted around it. So that's what that is. And you can see some of the art you couldn't see before. I have a calendar that's on the wrong month. All sorts of books over here. So let's get into this. Hagar's Daughter, chapter 32. Let's do it. At last, the eagerly looked for day of the Bradford murder trial came. Ah, yes, I remember the murder trial. Ha ha ha. Okay, what's going on? Let's read. At last, the eagerly looked for day of the Bradford murder trial came. Society had been on the qui-vive ever since Sumner's arrest, and in 24 hours preceding the opening of the trial, public interest had gone up to almost unparalleled intensity of excitement, which the facts already known of the case increased as the time for the crisis approached. Among these facts was the one of the disappearance of the principal witness for the defense. Extraordinary disclosures were anticipated, and the wildest rumors were afloat, some of which contained a few grains of truth. And the best rumors do contain a few grains of truth, as do the best lies. They're the most plausible. I've heard it said that when you're looking at something that is sinful, you're not looking for something between right and wrong. You're looking for something between right and almost right. I'll keep reading. The police told off for duty at the court had their work cut out for them, for crowds began to gather long before the opening hour, some to get in, some to see the notables in society, and the government swells arrive in quick succession. Before 10, the room was crowded in every available place, and further admission was refused except to those engaged in the case. Will Badger and Carol West, I remember them. Will Badger and Carol West made their way slowly to their places among a nest of their set, including Mrs. Brewer and Mrs. Vanderpool and other friends of Sumner. Badger and West expected to be called by the defense. The entrance of General Benson and Major Madison caused a flutter as they took their places in the space reserved for witnesses by the prosecution. Aurelia's tall, graceful form in a handsome dark gown followed the men. Have you read? I'm reading this book by Diana Gabaldon, Lord John and the Private Matter. Anyway, there's a mysterious woman in that book that wears a green dress. And I don't know. You know how I am. I just thought that's an interesting parallel. Aurelia's tall, graceful form in a handsome dark gown followed the men. She received the various salutes which came to her from all parts of the crowded room with her usual polished elegance, but the fashionable world was puzzled. There was that in her appearance which suggested tragedy. Let's keep reading. Good heaven, thought Carol West. I wonder if there could be any truth in the rumor I have just heard. What rumor did he just hear? How exquisite she looks, and pale. Yes, and anxious too. I wonder if she cares for Sumner. I wonder what it all means anyhow. Heaven help her safely through this ordeal. And she had need of all the sympathy that his kind heart could bestow, for the close of the trial would see her homeless, friendless, moneyless, under the ban of a terrible caste prejudice, doubly galling to one who, like herself, had no moral training with which to stem the current of adverse circumstances that had effectually wrecked her young life. Well, that's sad to have no moral training, but it's interesting to think, are Black people fit with the moral training so that we can live under the ban of a terrible caste prejudice? I got questions. But all society missed its queen, Jewel Bowen, about whom the wildest reports were circulated, but no one knew the truth concerning her trip out of town. Jewel had an interview with her husband early in the morning, and it was decided that Mrs. Bowen and she would not enter the courtroom until the day when Aunt Henny was to give her testimony. Sure now of Cuthbert's acquittal, the ladies were content to wait patiently the law's course. Let's see how that works out for them and for Cuthbert. General Benson was ignorant as yet of his prisoner's escape. Isaac had disappeared, and Ma'am Griffin did not dare send him word. So, in ignorance of the true state of affairs, he was his own imperious self. Presently, counsel were in their places. The Attorney General and a distinguished advocate for the government, and for the defense, ex-Governor Lowe of Massachusetts, brilliant in criminal cases, had associated with him the Bowen family lawyer, Mr. Cameron, and mightiest of all in interest of the accused was the guidance and keen incisive intelligence of the sleuth hound, E. Henson, chief of the Secret Service Division. Just after 10, the buzz of talk suddenly ceased, hushed by the indescribable settling of a crowd long in expectancy as the officials took their seats. The hush became breathless as the spectators waited the appearance of the one man for whom they had all gathered here that day, the prisoner. A buzz of admiration passed through the crowd as the accused passed to his seat. Erect, easy, dignified, Sumner took his place with the same grace that had marked his entrance into the crowded halls of pleasure. He met the steady stare of those 1,000 eyes, coolly, steadily. How splendidly he bears himself, whispered one to another. He had made a distinctly good impression. Now came the necessary formalities. The jury to be called, a mysterious algebraic proceeding to the uninitiated, where the value of the x is evolved to the amazement of the onlooker. Well, she just threw algebra in there. All of a sudden, the jury is like algebra. Go ahead then, Pauline Hopkins. The 12 men, good and true, were selected. The 12 men, historically accurate. The 12 men. A jury of your peers could only be men who could be citizens, legally could vote. Men. The 12 men, good and true, were selected in this instance with very little trouble for a case so widely known and discussed. All right. They were unchallenged, and so presently were duly sworn. Then the official question was put. How say you, prisoner at the bar, guilty or not guilty? Let me go back for a minute. The jury was only called right then. Voir dire happened right there at the trial. They were unchallenged, and so presently were duly sworn. Okay, so my experience with voir dire is that I've been called to jury duty, and I've sat in the room, and they ask all sorts of people all sorts of questions, but it's not at the moment of the trial. It's before the trial, and I don't know how they did this back in this day. I guess they could probably do it at the trial. I have been called to jury duty a number of times. I have never been selected for a jury. Every single time when my education comes up, I get dismissed summarily from the jury. They're like, what do you do for a living? And for the last time, I was running a writing center, and I said, I run a college writing center. And they said, what's your academic background that qualifies you for that? And I say, I have a PhD in English. And then like 10 seconds later, both sides dismissed me. All right. Okay, so the jury, they were unchallenged, and so presently were duly sworn. Then the official question was put. How say you, prisoner at the bar, guilty or not guilty? The answer came in clear tones, low and steadily. Not guilty. The Attorney General arose and began the trial with a recapitulation of the circumstances attending the murder of Elise Bradford and the evidence adduced at the inquest. And, said the learned counsel, there can be little doubt that the secret of the crime lies in the victim's past. Clever detectives are of that opinion, and they argue logically enough that the fear of exposure of a guilty secret has been once more the motive of a terrible tragedy. The prisoner admits that he had been particularly attracted by the murdered girl at one time. It is known that they were alone together all that fatal Sunday afternoon in the deserted Treasury building. He alone had exclusive opportunity to commit the crime. He admits that he gave her a glass of wine from the store kept for the chief's private use, but tells us that he left the victim in her usual health at 8 that night, she refusing his escort home on a plea of wanting to pack up her belongings as she did not intend to return to work the next week, having resigned her position. All this story will be provided a tissue of falsehoods unless the prisoner has the power to prove who did administer poison to the dead woman if he did not do it himself after he left the office on that fatal night. Burden of proof does not lie on the defendant. We are supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, not guilty until you can prove who did it. This isn't even not guilty until you can prove somebody else did it. This is not guilty until you can prove who did it. Gracious. I'm already mad at the miscarriage of justice and the trial just started. I don't know why. I keep having a life the size of my mouth. Well, anyway, the learned counsel weighed strongly all these stubborn facts in an eloquent speech, which told with the audience. The case looked black for the accused, but the brilliant ex-governor smiled serenely as he glanced over the sea of faces. The trial dragged itself along with varying interest through 2 days. On the third day, Aurelia Madison was called to prove the prisoner's gallantry and fickleness. She did not glance at the prisoner as she passed to the witness box, impassive and lovely, but gave her evidence in the clear, concise manner that carried conviction with it. When she had finished, the tide of public opinion was strengthened against the prisoner. Like a whited sepulchre full of hatred, she attempted to swear away the life of an innocent man to gratify her wish for revenge. Like a whited sepulchre. So a sepulchre is some sort of grave, something. I'm sure there's like a real specific definition that I don't know. But whited means it was whitewashed, like it was like old and dirty or whatever, and it got whitewashed, much like Aurelia herself. She's, like this revenge seeking, dirty on the inside, but clean looking on the outside. And we could also do it with race, right? Like she's got the soul of a black person in her, apparently with no home training, but she's white on the outside. She is like a whited sepulchre, full of hatred. She attempted to swear away the life of an innocent man to gratify her wish for revenge. By her testimony, society learned for the first time the secret of the broken engagement between the accused and Jewel Bowen. Her story caused a sensation. Heavens, it looks strange, whispered Mrs. Vanderpool to her neighbor, Mrs. Brewer, but the end was not yet. As the witness turned to leave the stand, Governor Lowe said blandly, "Oh, and let's not forget, like she's perjuring herself." But anyway, Governor Lowe said blandly, "One moment, Miss Madison. I wish to ask you a few questions." She was getting off of the stand before she had had her cross-examination. Come on now. Have they never watched an episode of Law and Order? Dun, 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 dun. Dun, 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 dun. Bow, 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 bow. Sorry. "One moment, Miss Madison. I wish to ask you a few questions." The girl paused. A white shade passed over the classic features. What in the world is a white shade? A shade can be a ghost, like a shade can be, like a shadow crossed her face. But what is a white shade? Is it that she is wearing a white shade? Or do we have the whole racial politics happening right now? The girl paused. A white shade passed over the classic features. "Are you Major Madison's daughter?" "Yes." "He is your father?" "Yes, so I am told." This laughed haughtily. That's an interesting way to reply, so I am told. I mean, if you ask me if my dad was my dad, yes, he's my dad. Not, so I am told. Hmm. Describe your mother as you remember her. Okay, if I were the other side, I would be objecting. I object. I don't know on grounds of relevance. Maybe I've watched too many episodes of Law and Order and The Practice and Ally McBeal and what's the one I like with Judge Lola Carmichael? Maybe too many judge shows in my life. Is he your father? Yes, so I am told. This laughed haughtily. Describe your mother as you remember her. I do not remember my mother. I never saw her. I know nothing of her. Where were you born? In Jackson, Mississippi, I am told. How much money were you to receive the day Mr. Sumner married you and General Benson married Miss Jewel Bowen? I don't understand your meaning. Weren't you to have $1 million given you the day you married Mr. Sumner? Yes or no? My dowry was $1 million, if that is what you mean. Call it what you like, young lady. That was your share of the booty with the man thrown in. That is all. A buzz of excitement went over the crowded room. The prosecution looked at each other in blank amazement. Major Madison moved about uneasily in his seat. He was the next one called. He knew very little of the prisoner. He was abroad at the time the engagement was made between the accused and Miss Madison, and could add little to the testimony already given. Knew Mr. Sumner as a visitor at houses where they were mutually acquainted, and had invited him to card parties in his own home. Again, the brilliant advocate asked but a few questions. Miss Aurelia Madison is your daughter? Yes. Born in Mississippi? The major nodded. Who was her mother? My wife. That's a slippery answer. Who was her mother? Who was her mother? My wife. The servant, slave, or what you might call her, that stood to you in that relation? Is it not so? Blandly insinuated the questioner. He's saying your wife was your slave, your servant. Which means she wasn't really your wife, was she? And the whole thing about being a slave, because we think of black people and slaves as synonymous. There is a lot going down right here. We object, interposed the Attorney General hurriedly to the evident relief of the enraged witness. I'm sure he did object. I was actually surprised they didn't object for badgering the witness when Aurelia was on the stand. We object, interposed the Attorney General hurriedly to the evident relief of the enraged witness. Your objection is sustained, returned the judge. Not at all disconcerted, Governor Lowe bowed pleasantly to judge, jury, lawyers, and witnesses in token of submission. Well, Major, did you ever know a man by the name of Walker? Or weren't you known by that name once yourself? Boom, boom, boom. Yes, I took that name when I was in money difficulties and hiding from my creditors. Oh! He was like, as a matter of fact, yes, you found me out on that. The man I mean was a slave trader, notorious all over the South, who was one of the band of conspirators that murdered President Lincoln. Did you ever meet him? So I've got some notes written, some questions I had from ages ago when I read this. So my notes say, is Mrs. Bowen Aurelia's mom and Hagar's daughter? That was a question I had. And then when with the Walker and I mean a slave trader, I wrote, ooh, I didn't get this at all. Is Aurelia who he was talking about when he accused Hagar of being black? Then I put, well, Aurelia isn't old enough. So those were some of the thoughts that were going through my head when I read this the first time. As I'm reading it this time, I can't say I'm thinking the same things, but like constantly, who is Hagar's daughter? And also with the President Lincoln. So, well, Major, did you ever know a man by the name of Walker? Or weren't you known by that name once yourself? Yes, I took that name when I was in money difficulties and hiding from my creditors. One, is it really that easy to just take a different name and be a different person and hide from your creditors? I've got questions, but maybe that flew back then. I don't know if that's, or maybe it is that easy right now. I don't know what people are doing. The man I mean was the slave trader, notorious all over the South, who was one of the band of conspirators that murdered President Lincoln. Didn't Benson have something to do with the murder of President Lincoln? Like what? What is afoot? Did you ever meet him? I never have, replied the witness, visibly disturbed. Business good, Major? How are the Arrowhead gold mine securities turning out? As well as I can expect, but not so well as you could wish. Meantime, you run a faro bank. I don't know what that means. Faro. Oh, is that a faro, Faro? Is that like a casino game? But not so well as you could wish. Meantime, you run a faro bank with your daughter as the snare and incidentally blackmail and bunco a rich family to repair your shattered fortunes. That is all, Major. Okay, there was no question in that at all. He was just giving his own little diatribe. The excitement increased momentarily among the spectators. It was easy to perceive that Governor Low was but reserving his forces. The last witness called by the prosecution was General Benson. And nothing was elicited from him but the fact that the murdered woman had worked in his department for 5 years, was competent and faithful. He had no knowledge of her family nor connections outside the office. He had noticed that Mr. Sumner was somewhat partial to the good-looking stenographer, but he attached no importance to that fact. He had been young once himself. The audience was captivated by his winning manners and genial smiles. Governor Low took all his rights in the cross-examination. You gave your name as Charles Benson, General? Ever known to the public by any other name? For a moment, the general was nonplussed. Sir, with freezing haughtiness, I do not understand you. My question was a plain one, but I will put it in another form. Weren't you originally known as St. Clair Ensign? Ooh. Isn't that the only name you have a right to wear? Ooh, St. Clair. Sensation in the courtroom. We object, from the Attorney General. Your objection is sustained, from the judge. Governor Low was in no wise disconcerted. Again, he bowed to the judge, then faced the witness, still bland and smiling. How old was Miss Bradford when she entered your employ? 18, I believe. A while back, you said you thought nothing of Mr. Sumner's attention to the good-looking stenographer because you were young once yourself. I hear you were still very partial to the ladies. Age has not deadened your sensibilities to their infinite charms. Playa, playa? Did not your attentions become so warm for that various pressing reasons you promised Miss Bradford marriage? Various pressing, like pressing is italicized. Various pressing reasons you promised Miss Bradford marriage? Your questions are an outrage, sir. Plain yes or no. That is all I want. Most emphatically, no, thundered the witness, livid with rage. Again, Governor Low bowed. Just one more question. Where were you on the night of the murder? In New York or Washington? I was in New York. The silence in the room was intense. One sensational question had followed another so rapidly that the vast throng of people found no expression for their wonderment save in silence. What was this man showing? Thank you, General. That is all. That closed the prosecution. By Jove, more lies under this than we can see, whispered West to Badger. Still, the testimony of the state was clear on all essential points, strengthened by numberless details pointing towards the guilt of the prisoner. So the third day ended, and the public felt repaid for their interest. It bade fair to go down in history as an extraordinary criminal incident. And that ends chapter 32 of Hagar's Daughter by Pauline E. Hopkins. I'm Rashonda Cade, and this is Reading with Rashonda.